The night was pitch black, the moon hidden behind heavy clouds that hung ominously over the desolate highway. Sarah had always been a bit nervous about driving alone at night, but tonight she had no choice. Her sister had fallen seriously ill and was in desperate need of medication that was only available at the distant pharmacy. Sarah clenched the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the darkness. The highway stretched ahead, a long, narrow strip of asphalt that seemed to disappear into an abyss. Sarah's headlights cut through the inky void, revealing only a few feet of road in front of her. The radio played a soft, eerie tune that matched the foreboding atmosphere. She couldn't help but feel a sense of unease that seemed to grow with every passing mile. As Sarah drove on, the rain began to fall, a steady drizzle that tapped ominously on the car's roof. She turned up the wipers, but the rain seemed to intensify, reducing visibility even further. Her heart raced, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The GPS on her dashboard had been acting up all evening, but now it flickered wildly, displaying a series of nonsensical directions. Sarah cursed under her breath, realizing she was lost. She pulled over to the side of the road, the sound of the rain pelting the car like 1,000 whispers. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, hoping to call her sister for directions. But as she dialed the number, there was only static on the line. No signal. Panic welled up inside her, and she tried again and again, but the result was always the same. Feeling trapped and alone, Sarah decided to continue driving, hoping to find a gas station or some sign of civilization. The rain continued to pour, and the wind howled mournfully, making her feel like she was the only person left in the world. As she drove on, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, with no signs of life in any direction. The forest on either side of the highway closed in, the trees looming like spectral sentinels. Sarah's mind began to play tricks on her, and she thought she saw shadowy figures darting between the trees. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered and died. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat as she coasted to a stop on the side of the road. She tried to start the car, but it remained stubbornly silent. Panic washed over her as she realized she was stranded in the middle of nowhere, alone in the darkness and the rain. Desperate, she grabbed her umbrella and stepped out of the car, the rain drenching her instantly. She opened the hood and peered inside, but she had no knowledge of car mechanics. She was completely helpless. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement in the trees. She turned, her heart pounding, and saw a figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of her headlights. It was too far to make out any details, but the sight of someone else in this desolate place sent shivers down her spine. "Hello," Sarah called out, her voice trembling. "Can you help me? My car broke down and I'm lost." There was no response. The figure remained motionless, like a ghostly sentinel in the night. Sarah's fear intensified, and she hurried back into her car, locking the doors. She desperately searched for her phone, hoping for a signal, but it was still dead. As she sat there, her heart pounding, she heard a soft, eerie sound coming from the forest. It was a haunting melody, a mournful tune that sent chills down her spine. She strained to listen, and it became clear that it was the sound of a violin. The music grew louder, the notes resonating through the darkness. It was beautiful and sad, a melody that seemed to tug at her very soul. Sarah couldn't help but be drawn to it, despite the fear that gnawed at her. With trembling hands, she opened the car door and stepped out into the rain once more. She followed the sound of the violin, moving deeper into the forest. The trees closed in around her, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. And then she saw him. A man dressed in tattered clothes, his face obscured by a hood, stood beneath a gnarled tree. He played the violin with a haunting skill, his fingers moving with an otherworldly grace. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. The man didn't respond. He simply continued to play, his eyes fixed on some distant point in the forest. Sarah took a step closer, her fear warring with a strange fascination. And then she saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They danced around the man, their movements graceful and hypnotic. Sarah's heart raced as she realized that she was surrounded, that these figures were not human. She turned to run, but the forest seemed to close in around her, the trees shifting and moving as if they were alive. As she stumbled through the forest, the music and the eerie dance growing louder and more frenzied, Sarah felt a growing sense of dread. She didn't know how she had ended up in this nightmare, but she knew that she had to escape. But no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't seem to find her way out of the forest. It was as if the very trees were conspiring to keep her trapped. The music and the dancing figures closed in around her, their glowing eyes fixated on her. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take it any longer, the music abruptly stopped, and the figures vanished into the darkness. Sarah stood alone in the forest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The rain had stopped, and the clouds had cleared, revealing a sky full of stars. Sarah realized that she was no longer lost. She knew exactly where she was. She was on the highway, not far from the pharmacy. She hurried back to her car, which started without a problem this time. She drove to the pharmacy, got the medication for her sister, and made it back home safely. But she could never forget that night, the night she got lost on a desolate highway and stumbled into a nightmare in the forest. The memory of the haunting music and the dancing figures would haunt her for the rest of her life, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things can happen when you least expect them. The night was cloaked in darkness, and a biting chill hung in the air as Mark prepared for his long drive home. He had spent the weekend at his friend's cabin deep in the woods, and now he faced a desolate, winding road that led through a dense forest. The solitude of the forest was unnerving, and the only companion Mark had was his old car, a beat-up sedan that had seen better days. Mark started the engine, and the car coughed to life with a reluctant groan. Its headlights cut through the inky blackness ahead, revealing the twisted road that disappeared into the depths of the forest. He gripped the steering wheel, and a sense of unease washed over him. There was something eerie about this road, something that sent shivers down his spine. As Mark drove deeper into the woods, the forest seemed to close in on him. The trees loomed like menacing giants, their branches clawing at the sides of his car. The wind whispered through the leaves, producing an eerie symphony of rustling and murmurs that sounded like ghostly voices. Mark shook his head, trying to dispel the unease that gnawed at him. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in his headlights. Mark slammed on the brakes, and his heart pounded in his chest. A woman stood in the middle of the road, her long, tangled hair obscuring her face. She wore a tattered white dress that billowed in the wind, and her pale skin seemed to glow in the dim light. Mark's instincts told him to drive away, but he couldn't just leave her there. Reluctantly, he rolled down his window and called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, swaying slightly in the breeze. Mark's unease deepened, and he decided to get out of the car and approach her. As he stepped onto the road, he noticed that the woman's feet didn't touch the ground. She was floating a few inches above it, and a cold dread gripped him. "Who are you?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. The woman slowly lifted her head, revealing hollow, pitch-black eyes that seemed to suck in the very light around them. Her lips curled into a sinister smile, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. Before Mark could react, she lunged at him, her ethereal hands reaching for his throat. With a scream, Mark stumbled backward and fell to the ground. The woman's ghostly form dissipated into the darkness, leaving him gasping for breath. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing, and jumped back into his car. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, tires screeching as he sped away from the horrifying apparition. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows danced in his peripheral vision, and he could hear faint whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Panic began to claw at his sanity as he realized he was trapped in this nightmarish maze of a road. Suddenly, His car's engine sputtered and died. Mark tried to restart it, but the key only turned uselessly in the ignition. He was stranded in the middle of the dark forest, with no sign of civilization in sight. Desperation washed over him as he fumbled for his phone, but there was no signal. As Mark sat in the darkness, a sense of dread settled over him. He knew he had to get out of the car and find help, but the forest had become an impenetrable wall of blackness, and the unsettling feeling of being watched had intensified. Reluctantly, he opened the car door and stepped outside. The moment his feet touched the ground, the forest came alive with eerie sounds. Whispers surrounded him, and phantom footsteps echoed through the trees. Mark's heart pounded as he ventured deeper into the woods, guided only by the dim moonlight that filtered through the dense canopy above. He stumbled upon an old, overgrown path that seemed to lead somewhere. Following it, he came upon an abandoned cabin, its windows shattered and its wood rotting. It looked like something out of a horror movie, but Mark had no other choice. He cautiously entered the cabin, his every step accompanied by creaking floorboards and the unsettling sensation of being watched. Inside, the cabin was filled with decay and decayed furniture. A cold draft swept through the rooms, and Mark's breath formed frosty clouds in the air. He explored further and discovered a diary on a dusty table. As he read it, he realized that he had unwittingly stumbled upon a place with a dark history. The diary spoke of a cursed road and a malevolent spirit that tormented those who dared to drive through the forest at night. Mark's blood ran cold as he realized that he was now a part of this horrifying tale. He had to find a way to break the curse and escape the clutches of the vengeful spirit. But as he turned to leave the cabin, a bone-chilling laugh echoed through the darkness. The ghostly woman from the road stood before him, her eyes gleaming with malevolence. "You can't escape," she hissed, her voice a haunting melody of torment. Mark's only hope was to confront the spirit and put an end to the curse. With trembling hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial of holy water. He splashed it at the spirit, and she screeched in agony as the water burned her ethereal form. In that moment of distraction, Mark ran out of the cabin and back to his car. Miraculously, the engine roared to life, and he sped away from the haunted forest, leaving the malevolent spirit behind. As he drove, Mark couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ghostly woman chasing him. But there was nothing there, just the winding road disappearing into the distance. The horror of that night would stay with him forever, a chilling reminder that some roads should never be traveled after dark. The old, decrepit car sat in the dimly lit garage, covered in a layer of dust and neglect. Its faded paint and rusted body told a tale of years gone by, of journeys long forgotten. But tonight, on a moonless night in the middle of nowhere, it would come to life once more. Ella had inherited the car from her late grandfather, a man who had always been a bit of a recluse. He had passed away under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a house full of secrets and a car that had not seen the light of day in decades. Ella had always been curious about her grandfather's past, and now, with the car keys in her hand, she was about to uncover a part of it. The night was unusually cold, and Ella's breath hung in the air as she stepped into the garage. The garage door creaked open, its rusty hinges protesting loudly against the intrusion. The car's interior smelled of must and decay, and Ella couldn't help but shiver as she settled into the driver's seat. She inserted the key into the ignition, and to her surprise, the engine roared to life with a deafening growl. The car's headlights pierced through the darkness, revealing a winding road that seemed to lead to nowhere. Ella hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The stories about her grandfather's strange adventures and the car's eerie reputation flooded her mind. But curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to go for a drive, if only to satisfy her burning questions. As Ella drove down the desolate road, a sense of unease settled over her. The dense trees on either side seemed to close in on her, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The wind whispered eerie secrets, and the moon played hide-and-seek behind heavy clouds. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, and the car's headlights revealed fleeting shadows darting through the woods. Hours passed, and Ella had lost all sense of time and direction. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, and the car showed no signs of running out of fuel. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen another vehicle or a sign of civilization. Panic began to claw at her chest as she realized she might be lost in this endless abyss of darkness. Just as she was contemplating turning back, Ella heard a haunting melody in the distance. It was the eerie sound of a violin, mournful and enchanting. She followed the sound, the car's tires crunching on the gravel road. The music led her to a clearing in the woods, where a flickering lantern hung from a gnarled tree branch. Ella parked the car and stepped out, drawn to the source of the music. In the center of the clearing, a figure in tattered clothing played the violin, its face hidden beneath a hood. The tune was both beautiful and haunting, and Ella found herself unable to look away. Without warning, the figure stopped playing and turned to face her. Beneath the hood, its face was a twisted, nightmarish mask of despair. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its voice, when it spoke, was a chilling whisper that sent shivers down Ella's spine. "You should not have come here," it hissed, the words carrying a warning that froze Ella in her tracks. But before she could react, the figure lunged at her, its bony fingers reaching out to touch her. Ella stumbled backward and fell to the ground, her heart racing. She scrambled to her feet and ran back to the car, the figure pursuing her with unearthly speed. Ella slammed the car door shut just in time, the figure's long, gnarled fingers inches from her face. She frantically turned the key in the ignition, and the car roared to life once more. With the figure still chasing her, she sped away from the clearing and back onto the winding road. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and Ella couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pursued by something supernatural. The car's headlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the road ahead. The darkness outside pressed in, and the road became narrower and more treacherous. As she drove on, Ella's fear gave way to a growing realization. The road was a labyrinth, a never-ending maze designed to trap and ensnare those who dared to venture into it. The car showed no signs of running out of fuel because it was a vehicle of the supernatural, tied to her grandfather's mysterious past. Desperation overcame Ella as she realized there might be no escape from this nightmarish journey. She was trapped in the car, on this never-ending road, pursued by a malevolent force. The car's headlights dimmed, and the engine sputtered as if it were about to die. In a final act of desperation, Ella slammed her foot on the gas pedal, willing the car to go faster. The engine roared, and the car shot forward, its tires screeching on the road. The world outside blurred into a chaotic frenzy of shadows and darkness. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, it stopped. The car skidded to a halt, and Ella found herself back in the dimly lit garage, the engine silent once more. She was safe, but her heart was still pounding, and her mind was filled with the nightmarish images of the road and the hooded figure. Ella stepped out of the car, trembling, and closed the garage door behind her. She knew she would never venture down that road again, never explore the dark secrets of her grandfather's past. Some things, she realized, were better left undisturbed, and some journeys were best left untraveled. As she walked away from the car, the memory of that eerie violin melody and the haunting figure in the woods lingered in her mind, a chilling reminder of the night she had taken a car ride into the unknown, never to return.